We are going to get you caught up on everything related to Iran. We're going to update you on the facts. We're going to talk about the constitutional issues, the legal issues, the ramifications. We're going to talk about the politics of it so that going into the week, you have a sense of kind of where we are. And I'm thrilled to have back with me Steve Cook, who is here really in no time whatsoever yesterday, and he's back. We're going to help you kind of put the pieces together and figure out what we should be most concerned about. And there are a lot of things. And more importantly, what we know and what we don't know. There are a zillion people who are rushing forward. Trump, the Republicans, people on TV who are saying, this is what we know. This happened or that happened. And you have to keep in mind, people who are speaking with certainty are the ones that are lying, because what we don't know is way bigger at this point than what we do know. So thank you all from Massachusetts, from all over the country, from Oregon. Thank you very much. I hope we have some of our European friends as well, because I'm sure they have an interest. California, welcome. And we have Newfoundland. Oh, fabulous.
Newfoundland.
Canada,
and I saw Cincinnati too.
All right. So let me do a brief recap of kind of what we know and where we are. Yesterday, the president, without real consultation, he may have chatted with a couple Republicans, but not the kind of consultation that we expect, not the so-called Gang of Eight. That's the Republicans and the Democrats on the Intelligence Committee and on the Armed Services Committee. That's the group of people who are supposed to be consulted. Without that, and clearly without any authorization, ordered planes to bomb 3 sites in Iran, which is engaged in an ongoing war with Israel, including the Fordo site, which Israel plainly did not have the capacity to take out. That's the site that's buried way beneath the ground. Those planes came home, thank God, without incident. And now, where are we? The president comes out and says, we've destroyed Fordo. The president said, this is a great success. The Secretary of State comes out and says, it doesn't matter what the intelligence actually says. He says, irrelevant whether, in fact, the president was telling the truth. And here we are. Congress is coming back to Washington, D.C. Some of the Republicans are defending Trump. Very few have come out to criticize him. Democrats range from, this is unconstitutional, we should impeach him right now, to we don't know, but this is outrageous, to Congress better get its act together. And that's kind of the range. That's where we start today. So, Steve, let me start with a very basic issue. Did the president lie when he took us to war? And really, by any definitions, we, if not are taking us to war, we are in a war.
Yeah. Well, did he lie? There is a difference of view within the intelligence community about the state of Iran's program. We know that Tulsi Gabbard and her people said that they did not believe that Iran was moving towards weaponization. Are they looking at that in a too lawyerly way, that Iran would actually have to have a weapon to conclude that there is a weapon, weaponization? We don't know. What the administration is now saying is that, one, the president drew a different conclusion from what Tulsi Gabbard and apparently the intelligence community drew, and that the president can decide what exactly he decides. And you notice that Secretary of Defense Hegseth said during the early morning briefing today was that instead of talking about weaponization, they talked about Iran's nuclear capability. That's different. That's different from
Correct. And that is really important. And frankly, by saying it's not relevant, they're telling us that they really don't have a nuclear weapon. And by saying that this was, urgent as the rationale for getting Congress there, we now know, frankly, whatever lawyerly definition, we were not on the cusp of having a bomb. And we would have known when Bibi Netanyahu went to the world and said, we have secret information that they're on the cusp of weaponization. We have no information whatsoever that that's the truth. And frankly, the language and the couching and the behavior of the administration today makes clearer that they didn't have that. Now, that is really important, folks. It's important from a political standpoint. It's important from a constitutional standpoint. It's important from an international law standpoint as well. If you think that grave harm is imminent, most people would concede that the president, because there's not time, something's imminent, something bad is going to happen, has the ability to act unilaterally, at least with consultation with Congress. If this was planned weeks and months ago, and they just don't like that Iran has an existing nuclear power and they would like to go to war, isn't that, Steve, the essence of the responsibility under the Constitution and the War Powers Act to come get some advice from Congress and maybe even authorization? This seems to me the typical war of choice.
This is no doubt a war of choice rather than a war of necessity. Now, let me point out before I get further into that is that the Israeli intelligence believed it had developed intelligence that would suggest that actually the Iranians were moving toward making those steps, increasing those steps towards weaponization. But of course, the Israelis, given where they're located versus where the United States is located, have a very different standard over what is the most important, what's going to set off alarm bells here. Now, to your question specifically, it strikes me that if they made the case, we just believe that the Iranian nuclear program is a threat more generally and we want to go to war, they're not going to get a lot of takers in Congress for that, especially given our history in the Middle East over the last 30 years. That's why it strikes me that the president, quote unquote, drew his own conclusions and decided to go. And of course, the typical bombast said that the United States had been entirely successful in knocking out the Iran program.
Let's start right there. Is there any way that he or anyone knows at this moment whether the Fordo program is completely eliminated, whether it's just damaged, what the precise condition of it is?
Look, the chief of the staff, General Kane, who the president refers to as Raising Kane, gave an excellent briefing this morning.
Yeah.
And he basically said, it's going to take time to develop information. We believe that we did significant damage to it, but we're going to have to do, the bomb damage assessment over a period of time that will tell us. That is different from what the president said at 10 o'clock on Saturday night, in which he said it was totally destroyed. And when I heard that, I was taking notes. I sort of giggled to myself because in early May, I was on a flight to Dubai and I watched a movie called The Apprentice, which is about Trump's relationship with his mentor, Roy Cohn. And what Roy Cohn told him, no matter what the outcome is, just tell people that you won. The scene was he actually lost a case in which he was accused, the Trump organization was accused of being racist. And it was a total drubbing. And they went out and said, we won, we were completely vindicated. And Trump looks at Cohn and Cohn says, yeah, that's what you have to do. You just have to tell people what's in your interest. And if you tell it enough, people will believe it. That is exactly what the president did last night. By within a few hours of bombing the site, said, we totally destroyed everything. There was no possible way. Even the president of the United States could have known that that was the case at that moment.
And this is what autocrats always do when they want to go to war. They lie. And that is a fundamental. Just forget about for a moment the War Powers Act, Article 2, all that stuff. A president cannot lie to the American people, to Congress, and to everyone else, take the country to war on false premise, and we all say, okay, well, we'll see how it comes out. That's not how our democracy operates. And for those people who say, well done, Mr. President, we'll talk about the merits in a moment, you can't then turn around and say, we care a lot about democracy. We care about the rule of law. We care about these restrictions. Oh, but by the way, if we like the outcome, we'll be a little less exacting in our analysis. No, folks, the rule of law means you follow the rules regardless of whether you think it would be a better idea or you like the outcome. The guy doing it always thinks he has a better idea, and that's how the rule of law gets shredded. Now, a lot of people are talking unconstitutional, Article 2, Article 1. Let me try to give a sense for people about how unclear this really is, and it's intentionally unclear. This is, I think, what you have to kind of keep in mind. There are two things that are in tension, and they're intended to be in tension in our Constitution. On one hand, the president is the commander in chief. On the other hand, only Congress has the right to declare war, the power to declare war. So, what happens kind of in that in between space? Well, Congress says if you're going to send troops into battle, into harm's way, you're going to have hostilities. Regardless of whether it's a war, you have to come and talk to us first. That's the War Powers Resolution. That's the law. And Trump clearly didn't do that. We can debate whether joining a war requires an exact authorization. I think it does. Other people may have a different view. I think this is fundamentally different than when Barack Obama sent a couple strikes into Syria to deal with their chemical weapons capacity. It was clear that that was kind of one shot, we're done. We were not engaged at that point in the civil war that was going on. This, we have become a combatant. What's your view, Steve, as to whether, number one, he should have come to Congress, and more important, why you come to Congress when these things are a little bit murky about what you're getting into?
Yeah. First, I actually think it was Trump who fired missiles at Syria over the use of chemical weapons early in his first term.
He did. You're right.
Yeah,
You're right.
it was which is interesting. There wasn't a lot of discussion at that because it was clear that was a one and done kind of thing. This is a much bigger undertaking than
Yes.
that. And so clearly the United States is likely to be involved in this over a longer period of time, given Iran's capacity to retaliate and what we don't think happened in terms of the nuclear program. But I do think, look, this is, as we discussed before, Jen, this is the push me pull you between the executive and legislative branches over and over again. And I was once, as a young intern, in the room with a former national security advisor who shall remain nameless, who declared the War Powers Resolution, quote unquote, a crock of shit. So this is, when you're in that seat, it seems like this is unnecessarily Congress impinging upon the powers of the commander in chief. When you're in Congress and you're an institutionalist, you say, hold on a second here. The founders gave us the power to authorize these things. It strikes me that, especially when it comes to a situation like this, where the United States is choosing to go to war, the United States has not been attacked. It is critically important for the president to consult seriously with the Gang of Eight about what they're about to do. That's why they are there, and that's why they're in those positions. But we see, Trump has ignored Congress. He can count on the Republicans to run interference for him. And there's been tremendous compromise of the rule of law. Look, I have lived in authoritarian countries, and I have said over and over to my friends that there is something, no offense meant to anybody here, but there's something very Turkish about the moment in which we are living.
Yes.
In which there is a leader with extraordinary executive power who basically gets to do whatever he wants.
That's right. Either Turkish or Hungarian power. Take your model. Now, let's get kind of into the nuts and bolts of this. I have trouble figuring out in what world this would be decisive unless the regime crumbles. And we keep saying that's not our intention. And at this point, there's no indication that it will. This is not Syria. Even if the supreme leader should die, there's a long list of people. The regime is in a fundamentally different position than was Bashar al-Assad after years and years and years of fighting. So if that is not going to happen, let's say Fordo is destroyed or almost destroyed, there is no guarantee that they will ever give up the power, the right in their minds, the desire to get a nuclear weapon. And the result may be they now sprint even faster because had they had a nuclear weapon, they never would have been attacked. How is it that people have this conception that this is going to settle it or remove the Iranian threat? What am I missing here in this
You're,
analysis?
you're not. I mean, and this is the excruciating dilemma that the president has now backed himself into.
Yes,
Um, to the extent that the nuclear program has not been destroyed, there's every incentive for the Iranian leadership to sprint towards a bomb.
yeah,
And the president has said Iran will never get a weapon.
yeah.
Okay, that means we're going
We're
to
back in it.
continue war, or the Iranian people will rise up against the regime and bring it down, and then fingers crossed, a new, more benign regime comes into power and rendering the whole issue moot. But that's a very, very uncertain thing. So the president is confronted with either a regime that has a nuclear weapon or having to encourage regime change, something he gave a speech in Riyadh a few weeks ago denouncing,
Yes, and
absolutely
which
denouncing. It was actually a pretty good speech. And
and which
so
absolutely.
this is where we are. It seems, once again, he did not think through the implications of what exactly he was doing.
Exactly. And the record of regime change, not only in Iraq, but in Libya, in Egypt, you could go down the list, is horrendous. We are very good, and I'll have a piece, folks, on this on Tuesday. We're very good at regime decapitation, regime destruction, regime leveling. Frankly, sometimes we're not even capable of that. See Vietnam. But in general, we have a lot of military power, so we can destroy regimes. What we are terrible at and what we have no capacity to do is to ensure that unless we're going to occupy for decades, and unless we have a total defeat of a regime that now wants to join the democratic world, we have really no ability to ensure the outcome is going to be any better. Is the Iranian Guard not going to pursue a nuclear weapon? Of course not. That's right up their alley. They don't care whether it's in the nature of the supreme leader and a religious, commandment. They think this is their survival. And you know what? We kind of just proved it to them that it is. Had they had a nuclear weapon, this wouldn't have happened. So,
Yeah.
what are they thinking that we're going to somehow get a better outcome?
Well, it's the president. And so he could say one thing 3 weeks ago in Riyadh and then act in an entirely different way in this situation. And people celebrate it as a bold move. I think on this question of regime change, undoubtedly, the United States failed in Iraq. I think Egypt, we didn't really engage in regime change. The Egyptian people tried to engage in regime change. In Libya,
push Mubarak out. So yes,
President Obama said, it's time for a transition, but really that was done by the Egyptian armed forces with the help of and then Libya, of course, was another failed case in which we were reluctant regime changers. But here's the point: my conversations with Iranians who oppose this regime would suggest that they neither wanted negotiations nor did they want a military strike. They believe that this regime will collapse in on itself and that it's up to the Iranian people to decide what kind of system they want. And they were right. Negotiations were essentially giving this terrible regime a lifeline. And a military strike, as you point out, and as everybody points out, has now given the regime, which there isn't a lot of evidence that it is on its way out, every incentive in the world to develop a nuclear weapon.
Right. Now, one of the other sort of looming issues, of course, is their ability to retaliate. As of this moment when we were speaking, we haven't seen that. But that could happen today. That could happen tomorrow. That could happen in 2 weeks. It could happen in the Middle East. It could happen at one of our embassies around the world. How do we kind of anticipate and defend ourselves, particularly with the crew that we have in this administration, to really minimize those and instead to get back to a diplomatic realm where our people wouldn't be in danger for an undetermined period of time?
Let me scare you a little bit. The chief counterterrorism official at the Department of Homeland Security is some 22-year-old former intern who has no experience whatsoever. So, Iranian state TV is quoting Iranian officials that, the night is going to be a terrible night for Americans. I think that this is kind of state TV bombast.
Oh.
But what people have to understand is that Iran has a global reach. They have committed horrible acts of terrorism in Argentina in the 1990s, in Lebanon in the 1980s, in Europe. They've assassinated people. This is a regime that the former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage called the A team, funded the A teams of terrorism. And so Americans are now going to have to be on guard both at home and abroad because the Iranians do have a lot of capacity. It may not be a ballistic missile fired at Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE where there are American planes. It may be the bombing of an American company or place where Americans gather in some part of the world. So this is the particularly frightening aspect of this, is that the Iranians actually have a variety of means to respond to the United States in a number of realms. As I said, terrorism, missiles, cyber, a whole host of things that I don't think, given the kind of bombast that the president provided the American people, that they've given a lot of thought to. And of course, he's neutered the government, the part of the government that would be that would defend against this. CISA is gone.
Yes.
The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have been harnessed to this, let's deport every immigrant in the country rather than focus on what are actual threats.
And by the way, if you ever needed a reason why we shouldn't be using the military on the streets of cities, this is it. We need our military training. We need our military on alert. We need our military doing things that the military does, not patrolling the streets of Los Angeles. I want to ask you two questions about Israel. First of all, if Trump is right and he's destroyed this, why is Israel still fighting? And when are they going to finally end this? And the second question is, why didn't Barack Obama, excuse me, Freudian slip, Obama probably would have gotten something. Why did Donald Trump not get anything from the Israelis? Like, we're done with the Gaza war. Like, okay, we'll move forward to day 2. Did he just do this without bargaining? Is he the greatest sucker on the face of the planet? Did he just get his pocket picked?
Let's do this the second one first. Yes. I mean, in some ways, look, remember the United States moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Yes.
And so everybody looked around and said, and so what did he get in return?
Yeah.
And they said nothing. And when you read Jared Kushner's book, which none of you have to, I did it for you and I reviewed it in Foreign Policy magazine. So please, it's one of the worst books I ever read. But what Jared said was moving the embassy would give the Israeli people would respect and love the president. And that was it. It was clearly a giveaway to the evangelical base of the Republican Party. They didn't get anything real from the Israelis for doing them this favor of moving the embassy.
Yes.
And so you can imagine, given that precedent, that Trump, he became very impressed on the morning after the Israelis began Operation Rising Lion with how technically proficient the Israelis were. And they are. And it was an extraordinary operation, imaginative, devious, and effective in a variety of ways. And suddenly he was leaning into it. And he was praising it, and it was and so on. It was very, very effective. And so he started to own it. So he didn't ask them for anything. Second, why are the Israelis still fighting? Well, I think there's two reasons. One, the Iranians fired on Israel and injured a number of people in a ballistic missile attack overnight, which goes to show that as much damage as the Israelis and the United States has, the Iranians still have a lot of capacity. The other thing is, I think, is probably an implicit admission, that for as much damage as the United States did to Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, they didn't do as much as the president has suggested. And the Israelis and Prime Minister Netanyahu said it himself. He said, we will continue until our goals are met.
And what is that goal? He has talked at times about regime change. This is another example that you cannot avoid the conclusion that Netanyahu needs perpetual war to stay in power. And at some point, the Israeli people will have to ask, why is it that we're taking civilian damage? Why is it that we're continuing to have civilian casualties when the president of the United States, our great friend, is saying, listen, we've done all that we can do? So that is a serious, serious problem. Let me switch gears as we reach the end of our time. If you are advising members of the minority on the Intelligence Committee or on the Defense Committee, on the Armed Services Committee, what should they be doing now, both in terms of the War Powers Act and what are the kind of questions they should be asking when they eventually get briefed?
Well, again, on the War Powers Act, I think that this is something that is not going to be resolved in this situation. They can invoke it, they can talk about it, but clearly the administration is going to ignore them on it. And since they're a minority, mostly what they can do is they can draw attention to it and shame the Republicans on this. But who knows whether that will work, given the kind of iron grip the president has on virtually every member of the Republican caucus. I think when it comes to briefings, and getting Secretary Rubio and the CIA Director John Ratcliffe and Tulsi Gabbard in there, I think that they're particularly in the open sessions. There are open sessions and then there are closed sessions of these.
Yep.
They're going to have to account for the contradictory statements. I mean, I would zero in on what Secretary Rubio meant when he said the president has drawn his own conclusions.
Yeah.
You mean to tell me that Tulsi Gabbard, who is there, now, I have my own questions about her as a political actor, but if we're going to play this straight, she is there to coordinate the activities of all 18 American intelligence. And if it's their collective assessment that Iran wasn't moving towards weaponization or did not have an assent, why did the president say that why did the Secretary of State say that the president drove a different conclusion? That needs to be emphasized in front of the cameras for the American people, that there is this huge gap. Yeah. Huge gap between what is supposed to happen and what actually happened. That would be the number one thing I would tell people to do.
Absolutely. And I would just add this. In 2020, a bunch of Democrats did try to not even slip in, they tried to insert into the 2020 Defense Authorization Act a provision that the president should not go to war against Iran without consulting with them. It ultimately was taken out, but that's the role of Congress now. They need to introduce, they can't do anything about the past, but they should introduce the War Powers Resolution, which frankly says in 60 days, you have to pull whatever troops are engaged back. You have to consult with us going forward. And secondly, they are right now negotiating the next fiscal year's budget. Use the Defense Authorization Act to try to put some constraints. Now, are Republicans going to go along with this? Probably not. But there may be a few. There may be a Rand Paul. There may be a Thomas Massie who at least would give some support. And frankly, Democrats have a constitutional, a political obligation to try. Make them take that vote. Make them be responsible for everything. And, then they can go to the American people and say, why are these people even in Congress since they do nothing? They're lumps on a log. They've outsourced their job to Trump. You need actual members of the legislative branch. Vote for us. So I think it's really important for them to make a huge deal. Forget the technical issues, that no president should be able to take a gamble this big, a possible engagement in another prolonged war, simply on his own, in disregard of the facts, without consulting Congress. And, oh, by the way, without the support of the American people. When this happened, about 16% of the American people were in favor of going forward. That's not what a constitutional government, that's not what a democracy is about. The king doesn't just decide, okay, everyone's against it, but we're going down to war and I'll make up whatever cock and bull story I have to in order to get this through. So a lot ahead. Final thoughts, Steve?
Well, look, I think that that's right. I think that, you have to force the Republicans into having an open conversation about this. Of course, there's political risk for Democrats as well. One can imagine the, Republicans, leaders of the Republicans, identifying, how terrible this regime is and what a threat it is. And those things are true.
Yes.
But the question is, are there other means to handle that? And that is how we've gotten to this point of a war of choice rather than a war of necessity. Have we exhausted every possible means before taking this forward? Now, I suspect that there are a lot of people who do believe that we've gone the extra mile. But as we were just talking about, the president seems to be at odds with his own government over what exactly the Iranians were up to.
Right. And I would leave with one additional thought, and that is both as a matter of international law, which the president, by the way, is obligated to uphold, and a matter of strategic necessity. We have always been against wars of aggression and wars of choice for other powers. Every time we do this, every time we make up a pretext, every time we go to armed forces, not as a last result, but as a first result, or as a pretext, or as a political matter, we encourage other regimes to do it. And one of the downside effects is, how will other countries in the region and around the globe take this in? And will we, frankly, have unleashed a new era in which the rules are off? Everyone's taking potshots at everyone. Everyone's making up their own facts. Everyone's making up the stories. Is that a world we really want to live in and where America is going to benefit? Well, I suppose we're going to find out, because I suspect that's going to happen. Steve, I cannot thank you enough. Not only once, but twice this weekend. You've come in on such short notice to help explain to you. And thank you, Contrarians, again for gathering in huge numbers to get caught up, to get informed. Here is the action item. Call your representative, Democrat, Republican, senator, congressman, and demand they take control, demand they invoke the War Powers Act, demand they get consultation, demand that if this is still going on in 60 days, whatever forces are pulled out. They have an obligation, and you have access to your lawmakers. Make the call, send the email. This is something that every one of you can do. So please stay engaged. Thank you for supporting the Contrarian, and your obligations now as a citizen in this democracy. So we will keep you apprised. We'll be back Monday with our usual Coffee with Contrarians, and we will keep you up to date. So thanks very much. Have a great evening, everyone, and thank you again, Steve. You've been terrific.
Thanks to you, Jen. Appreciate it.